What if a child who never spoke, suddenly hugged a stranger? And what if that one moment shattered the world of a billionaire father watching from across the room? Could a single act of kindness rewrite the story of 3 lives forever? Stick around, because the answer will take you somewhere you never expected. Most people never notice the quietest tragedies. They don't recognize them because they rarely scream. They don't announce themselves like sirens or shatter the air like glass. No, the quietest tragedies move beneath the surface, like an undertow you don't see until it's pulling you under. And no one knew that better than Graham Whitaker. To the outside world, Graham was untouchable, steel-willed, meticulously groomed, always one move ahead of the market. His name was stitched into the fabric of global logistics, railways, ports, shipping routes, supply chains. If it moved, Graham had probably signed the deal that made it happen. But for all his power, there was one thing he couldn't move, couldn't reach no matter how much he spent, no matter how many experts he summoned to his estate. His own son. Noah Whitaker hadn't spoken in 376 days. Not a word. Not a whisper. He had once been a laughing toddler, wild curls bouncing as he chased leaves in the backyard. But something had shifted. At first, it was subtle, longer silences, eyes drifting away during conversations, hands twitching near his collar. And then it grew. By the time Graham realized it wasn't a phase, his son had retreated somewhere unreachable. The doctors used terms that didn't fit into Graham's world. Autism spectrum. Sensory processing disorder. Selective mutism. But none of them could explain the most haunting truth of all. Noah would not look him in the eye. And he had never, not once, hugged his father. It was a bitter morning in Asheville, North Carolina, when Graham decided to try something different. He didn't tell his staff. Didn't alert his assistant. He simply put on a crisp white shirt, took Noah's small hand in his, and drove them both down the winding roads toward town. They pulled into a parking lot behind a narrow red brick diner with fogged-up windows and a crooked sign that read Pine Hollow Cafe. Noah blinked at the morning light. He was 7, but so small for his age, as if his silence had somehow stunted his growth. He didn't ask where they were. He didn't ask anything. He just gripped his father's sleeve like it was the only tether to safety he had left. Inside the cafe, the smell of toasted bread and maple syrup hung in the air like a lullaby. Old jazz hummed through a dusty speaker. The booths were patched with duct tape. The mugs didn't match. And somehow, it was perfect. No one looked twice at Graham. That's the thing about small towns, they don't care how many zeros are in your bank account if you can't smile back. They took a booth by the window. Graham sat like a statue, trying not to disturb anything. Noah curled into himself, knees tucked, shoulders tight, eyes scanning the corners for threats that weren't there. And then, Clara Reyes walked in. She didn't glide. She didn't sparkle. But she moved like sunlight does, slow, warm, unnoticed until you felt it on your skin. She had been working at Pine Hollow for just over a year, a last-minute job after life had pulled the rug out from under her ambitions. Once on track to become an occupational therapist, she had left school when her mother got sick. Since then, she traded patient charts for coffee pots and diner aprons. But some instincts don't fade. She spotted the boy before she saw the man. The way his fingers tapped out invisible rhythms on the table's edge. The subtle panic in his body, like he was ready to run without moving. Clara didn't smile like most people do around children, too bright, too forced. She just looked at him softly, then glanced at the man beside him. There was something about him too. Tension so deep it had become posture. A sadness that didn't know where to rest. "Warm milk?" she asked quietly, addressing the boy, not the man. Graham looked surprised, as if he expected a barrage of questions or worse, pity. But Clara simply stood still, waiting. Noah didn't answer. But his eyes flicked toward her. A fraction of a second. Most wouldn't notice it. She did. It might have ended there, just another silent meal in another forgotten day. But fate has a funny sense of timing. From the kitchen came a crash. A plate. Ceramic against tile. Loud. Final. The kind of sound that doesn't just fill a room, it severs it. Noah flinched violently, his back arching. His breath shortened. He shoved his hands over his ears and began to rock. Graham panicked. He reached across the table, but stopped midway, paralyzed. How many times had he tried to hold his son, only to have Noah recoil as if touch itself was a threat? "Noah," he said urgently, "it's okay. It's just a plate." But Noah was somewhere else now. The diner froze. Conversations halted. Forks hung in midair. Even the jazz paused. And Clara moved. She didn't rush. She didn't drop into a crouch like some do, trying to match a child's eye level and failing. She simply walked a few steps forward and knelt, just far enough not to intrude, just close enough to be seen. She didn't say a word. Instead, she opened her arms. Noah stopped rocking. Graham's heart seized. Seconds stretched into something more than time. And then, impossibly, the boy stood. He stepped away from the booth. Slowly, almost as if underwater, he walked toward Clara. And folded himself into her. The entire cafe held its breath. Graham sat frozen. He wasn't sure what shocked him more, that Noah had embraced a stranger, or that the moment felt less like a betrayal, and more like grace. Clara held the boy with the kind of patience most people reserve for miracles. She didn't pat his back. She didn't whisper affirmations. She simply existed beside his storm until it passed. Eventually, Noah stepped back. His breathing had calmed. His shoulders had lowered. He looked lighter. Graham cleared his throat. Thank you." But Clara wasn't looking at him. She was watching Noah, who had returned to the booth and picked up a crayon from the kids' menu. He wasn't drawing. Just holding it. Sometimes, that's enough. As Graham drove Noah home that day, the boy sat with his head tilted toward the window, watching the trees blur by. Graham wanted to say something. Anything. But there were no words for what had just happened. No language for a man who's just seen the impossible become real. That night, after Noah had fallen asleep curled around his favorite blanket, Graham sat alone in his study, phone in hand. He looked up Clara Reyes. There wasn't much to find. A few old college articles. A scholarship. A fundraiser for her mother's treatment that ended with "goal not met." A LinkedIn profile that hadn't been updated in 3 years. But what he remembered most wasn't online. It was the way she didn't look surprised when Noah hugged her. As if, deep down, she'd been waiting for him all along. Graham didn't know it yet, but something had shifted. Not in Noah. Not even in Clara. But in him. Because when you've spent your whole life building walls, the first crack can feel like the end of the world. But sometimes, it's the beginning. It took Graham Whittaker the entire night to decide whether to go back. Not because he wasn't certain of what he had witnessed, but because he didn't know what it meant. The image of his son curled into the arms of a stranger had etched itself into his mind like something sacred and unexplainable. That single moment had cracked open a part of him he had long buried beneath discipline and data, control and calculation. And now, in the fragile quiet of morning, he found himself standing once again beneath the flickering sign of Pine Hollow Cafe. Clara Reyes was pouring coffee into a chipped ceramic mug when she saw him through the glass. She hadn't expected him to come back, and yet something in her stillness suggested she wasn't surprised either. She carried herself like someone who had learned long ago that the extraordinary often hides in the ordinary, that some of the most profound changes begin with the simplest gestures. He waited until the crowd thinned out, until the diner exhaled into its late morning lull. Then he approached the counter, hat in hand, like a man unsure of his place. "Thank you," he said, voice low, graveled by something more than sleep. Clara looked up briefly from the coffee pot. "He's a sweet boy." Graham paused, then nodded, like he wasn't sure whether he agreed or was just grateful someone else thought so. He doesn't let people touch him. Not therapists, not specialists. Not even me. Her expression didn't shift, didn't widen with surprise or soften with pity. It remained steady. "But yesterday," he continued, "he walked across a room and hugged you." Clara wiped her hands on her apron. She didn't say she had noticed. She didn't say that she still felt the weight of his small body resting against her chest, the way his breathing had slowed, like he had been holding a storm inside and finally let go. Instead, she said, "Sometimes kids just know." There was a long silence between them. And then Graham reached into his coat and pulled out a business card, holding it as if it weighed more than it should. "I don't know what your life looks like outside of this place," he said. "But if there's any chance you'd consider spending some time with Noah." Clara looked at the card but didn't take it. Her eyes flicked to his, not with suspicion, but something else. Something almost mournful. "I'm not offering a job," Graham added quickly, almost awkwardly. "Not exactly. I thought maybe you could read to him. Sit with him. Or not. Whatever feels right." She let the silence hang, then slowly nodded. "I'll come by. Just once. Let's see how he does." The house stood like a fortress in the hills outside Asheville, all glass and stone, overlooking the French Broad River. Clara had never seen anything like it, not in person. It wasn't cold, exactly, just hollow. Beautiful, but lonely. Like it had been designed for someone who'd forgotten what a home was supposed to feel like. Graham opened the door himself, not waiting for the butler this time. Clara followed him through the hallways, her footsteps soft against marble floors. She carried nothing but a worn leather tote slung over one shoulder. Inside were a few children's picture books, a bundle of colored pencils, and a sketch pad that had seen better days. Noah was sitting cross-legged in the corner of the sunroom, eyes trained on the window as if he were waiting for something he wasn't sure would come. Clara sat down on the opposite side of the room. She didn't speak. She didn't approach. She simply opened her sketch pad and pulled out a pencil. After a moment, she asked quietly, "Would you like to draw with me?" Noah didn't respond. But he didn't leave, either. And that, for now, was enough. For the first 10 minutes, Clara drew quietly. Nothing elaborate, just soft outlines of trees and clouds, a crooked little turtle. Her lines weren't perfect. In fact, they weren't even good. But they were patient. Then, without a word, Noah stood, crossed the room, and picked a crayon from the tin beside her. Red. He didn't draw. He simply held it, watching her. By the end of the hour, Clara had a page filled with uneven houses, a misshapen sun, and one red squiggle in the corner. She smiled and closed the sketchbook like it was a masterpiece. She came back the next day. And the next. They didn't talk. But something between them began to hum quietly, like music heard through a wall. Clara began to build rituals, not routines, not therapies. Rituals of connection. She invented a game she called color duets. Each day, Noah would pick a color. Clara would pick one to match. Then, without rules or goals, they would draw together, shapes overlapping, colors blending into accidental landscapes. One day they created a mountain. Another day, a river. Some days it was just lines and loops. There was also silent story time. Clara would sit beside him with a book closed on her lap and tell a story using only her hands and facial expressions. She acted out characters, made animals from shadows on the wall, and once used spoons and napkins to retell an entire fairy tale. Noah never laughed. But he didn't leave either. One afternoon, Clara brought something new, a white feather she'd found in her car, tucked beneath the seat. She called it the feather test. She didn't explain it. She just held it in her palm and let it drift gently toward Noah's wrist. He flinched the first time, then watched with fascination as it brushed past him. The third time, he leaned in slightly. She never asked permission for these moments. She waited for him to offer it silently. Graham watched all of it from the hallway security monitor. Every visit. Every tiny change. At first, it unnerved him, this intrusion into the world he tried so carefully to manage. But over time, it became something else. He watched as Noah began humming again, softly, almost inaudibly, when Clara entered the room. He saw how his son's body, once perpetually tense, began to relax. How his hands, always clenched, now rested open in his lap. And in the watching, something unfamiliar stirred in Graham, awe. And maybe a little fear. Because here was a woman with no clipboard, no degrees on her wall, no clinical charts or calculated plans. And yet she was doing what an army of specialists couldn't. She was reaching him. One evening, Clara arrived with a fresh notebook and gently tore out a blank page. She handed Noah a blue pencil and whispered, "You draw first today." Noah stared at the page. He pressed the pencil to paper. Then stopped. He didn't look at her, but his hand moved. One line. Another. A jagged form began to emerge, two small circles, a larger one beneath them. A child's version of a person. Then another beside it. And then a third, slightly apart, with what looked like a heart between them. Graham stood watching from the hallway, breath caught in his chest. It wasn't art. It wasn't even clear. But it was a message. That night, after Clara had left, Graham stood outside the sunroom and looked at his son. Noah was tracing his finger over the heart on the drawing, as if memorizing its shape. Graham didn't speak. He just sat down quietly on the floor beside him, not touching, not crowding, just there. And in that stillness, for the first time in a very long time, Graham understood something terrifying and beautiful. He wasn't the one saving his son. Clara wasn't saving him either. Noah was saving himself. All they were doing, what truly mattered, was being there when he did. The trouble didn't start with malice. It never does. Not the kind that leaves scars on the invisible parts of a person. Not the kind that takes something delicate and ruins it, not with a smash, but with something far more dangerous, casualness. It was a Saturday like any other at Pine Hollow Cafe. Clara had been back at work since just after dawn, moving through the morning rush with the quiet rhythm of someone who had learned how to listen to the hum of life without demanding anything from it. She had slipped into the diner's familiarity like an old sweater, taking orders, pouring coffee, glancing at the booth near the window more often than she needed to. It had become a habit she didn't name. Even when they weren't there, she looked. Just in case. Graham and Noah hadn't visited in a few days. That wasn't unusual. Clara never asked for consistency. She had learned the hard way that some things, especially the important ones, couldn't be scheduled. Still, when they did appear, quietly slipping into their usual corner like ghosts only she could see, something in her exhaled. Noah had been different that morning. He walked in carrying something. Not an object, but a kind of energy, something lighter in his chest. Clara could tell by the way he didn't hide behind his father's coat, by the way his eyes scanned for her almost instinctively, like a child looking for shelter. They sat. Clara brought warm milk without asking. She didn't crouch. She didn't say much. She simply placed the mug down, gave a gentle nod, and walked away. The boy reached for the mug himself. That small act, a miracle in the form of movement, would have meant the world to anyone paying attention. But someone else was watching too. Someone who wasn't part of the story. Someone who saw the moment and misunderstood everything about it. A woman in her mid-30s, passing through Asheville on a scenic fall road trip, had settled into a corner booth near the window, phone in hand, camera always ready. She had no reason to notice the boy or the man, no context for their story, no reverence for the sacred space quietly unfolding before her. But when Noah, startled at the scrape of a chair, flinched just slightly and then instinctively climbed into Clara's arms, when he wrapped his thin arms around her waist and buried his face in her apron like it was the only place on earth that felt safe, something compelled her to snap a picture. She didn't ask. She didn't hesitate. She just lifted her phone and took the shot. It was uploaded within minutes. The caption read, "Small town moment. Billionaire's son cuddles with waitress. Sweet or suspicious?" She didn't mean harm. But she didn't mean care either. And in that absence of care, a wildfire was born. By the time Graham saw the photo, it had been reposted half a dozen times. First by regional gossip accounts. Then by a national parenting blog with a habit of leaning into scandal. Then by a tabloid that thrived on whispered narratives and misleading headlines. Billionaire's son clings to mystery waitress during emotional outburst, insider or opportunist. The words hit like a punch to the chest. Graham was walking out of a board meeting when his assistant caught up to him, phone in hand, eyes wide. She didn't say much. Just showed him the screen. It was a grainy image, taken through the foggy glass of Pine Hollow's window. But there was no mistaking what it captured, Noah's small figure, wrapped tightly around Clara. Her hands cradling him without possession. His face tucked into the curve of her ribs like he'd lived there forever. And just behind them, barely visible in the blur, Graham, staring through the moment with a look of helplessness on his face. He didn't open the article. He didn't need to. The damage had already been done. By the time Clara's shift ended, the story was everywhere. She saw it only because another server had left the article open on a phone near the coffee machine. The headline glared up at her like something cruel pretending to be curious. She didn't click on it. She didn't need to. The photo alone told her everything. The violation wasn't just in the exposure, it was in the distortion. A moment so sacred, so delicate, twisted into content. She sat in the back room during her break, away from the noise, and reached into her tote bag. Inside was a folded piece of paper, softened at the edges from being opened and closed too many times. It was the drawing Noah had given her weeks earlier. 3 stick figures beneath a crooked tree. 2 holding hands. 1 in the middle. A heart between them. She stared at it, trying to breathe. There was no call from Graham. No message. Just silence. The next day, while she was refilling salt shakers during the lull between breakfast and lunch, the manager approached her with a note scribbled on scrap paper. "He said to give you this," he mumbled. The note read, "The arrangement is over. No further contact. No signature. No explanation. Nothing." She nodded once, folded the note, and placed it next to Noah's drawing in her bag. She didn't cry. Clara Reyes didn't cry easily. But something deep inside her, something stitched from hope and patience and days spent in silence beside a child who had taught her more about trust than any therapist ever could, began to ache. She didn't text him. She didn't go to the house. She didn't demand to explain. Maybe she should have. Maybe another person would have marched to the front gate and demanded a conversation, an apology, an ounce of decency. But Clara had spent too long learning the language of those who can't say what they need out loud. She knew when a door was already closed. Outside, customers chatted over omelets and coffee. Unaware that something rare and holy had just been broken. Across town, Noah stopped waiting at the window. He stopped coloring. He stopped humming. The sunroom, once alive with scattered crayons and quiet rituals, sat still. The air felt heavier. The light less warm. At night, Graham heard movement from the hallway. He followed the sound to Noah's room and found the boy curled into his blankets, eyes wide open. His arms were wrapped around a scarf, Clara's, left behind weeks earlier. He wasn't crying. He was too far inside for that. Graham walked in slowly and sat on the edge of the bed. He didn't touch him. Just sat, as if his presence could fill the cavern that had opened. "I know you miss her," he said softly. Noah didn't look up. He just whispered something into the folds of the blanket. Graham leaned closer. "This one's not warm," the boy murmured. And there it was. The crack that let in the flood. Graham left the room and closed the door gently behind him. In the hallway, he pressed both palms against the wall and lowered his head like a man praying. He had tried to protect Noah. From scandal. From strangers. From everything. But what he had really protected him from was the one thing his son had fought to find: connection. He had been afraid of vulnerability. Of stories getting twisted. Of his name in places he couldn't control. And in that fear, he had destroyed something his son had only just begun to trust. That night, the house felt quieter than it ever had. Not peaceful. Empty. The silence wasn't a void anymore. It was a wound. The silence lasted longer than either of them probably expected. Clara Reyes didn't reach out, not because she didn't want to, but because she understood the weight of assumption. Some silences are empty. Others are decisions. This one, she feared, was the latter. She returned to her shift at Pine Hollow Cafe like nothing had changed, even though everything had. She still refilled mugs, still wiped down menus, still offered the same gentle smile to the regulars who had no idea that the center of her quiet world had gone missing. The weight she carried wasn't something you could see unless you knew where to look. A stiffening in her shoulders, a moment longer spent staring out the window, the way her hand hovered over the napkin dispenser like she expected something to be there. The note from Graham, curt, and signed, "Final," remained folded in the bottom of her tote bag. She hadn't thrown it away. Not because she clung to hope, but because part of her couldn't believe that something so sacred could end with so little ceremony. And yet, endings rarely come when we expect them. Or how. Across town, inside his angular glass sandstone estate perched above the river, Graham Whitaker sat behind his oak desk reading a report with hands that trembled slightly. The document had been compiled by his head of security, a former military investigator now repurposed for background checks, vetting contractors, and, as of recently, tracking digital footprints. The conclusion was unambiguous. The viral photo, the image that shattered everything, hadn't come from inside his staff. It hadn't come from Clara. It hadn't come from anyone remotely connected to the story that had been so violently yanked from privacy into spectacle. It had been posted by a traveler from Ohio, a woman who tagged the cafe as a hidden gem and shared the image to her lifestyle blog for clicks. The picture had then been picked up by a small local newsletter, then crawled into larger syndicates through an algorithm that didn't care what damage it did, only that people were looking. No ill intent. Just ignorance. That somehow made it worse. Graham reread the paragraph 3 times, as if repetition might soften the guilt pressing hard into his chest. Clara hadn't done anything wrong. She hadn't broken trust. She had simply existed in kindness, and been punished for it. He stood from his chair slowly and walked down the hallway to the sunroom, where Noah sat with his knees drawn up, back against the wall, staring at the blank page of a sketchpad. The crayons remained untouched. The window, where he used to wait for her, now stayed closed. Graham had tried. He had read to Noah, sat beside him, attempted to replicate Clara's rituals with a mechanical clumsiness that made his son flinch. He brought in new books, new toys, new specialists, all wrapped in the same expensive detachment that had failed him before. It wasn't presents Noah was missing. It was her. Graham watched his son now, small and withdrawn, the weight of the world pressing down on shoulders too young to carry it. He hadn't heard Noah hum in days. His sleep had become fragmented, startling awake at strange hours, clutching Clara's forgotten scarf like a lifeline. It wasn't just that Noah had lost someone. It was that he'd begun to understand loss. And Graham, for all his intelligence, for all the systems he had built and led, had no map for grief that small and that honest. The next morning, he drove without telling anyone. He didn't call ahead. He didn't prepare a speech. He just drove to the one place that had changed everything, the Asheville Community Art Center. He found Clara in the children's room, sitting on a beanbag chair with a paperback book in her lap, reading softly to a semicircle of toddlers and tired-looking mothers. Her hair was pulled back in a loose knot. Her voice carried the same rhythm it always had, patient, melodic, anchored. Graham stood in the doorway longer than he intended to, watching her hand move gently along the page as she brought the story to life. She wasn't performing. She was simply there. Fully. When the story ended, and the children wandered off in search of juice boxes or coloring pages, Clara looked up and saw him. Her expression didn't shift. Not right away. There was recognition, certainly. But no anger. No surprise. Just quiet awareness. As if some part of her had known he'd come eventually. He approached slowly, something heavy in his hands, not guilt, not shame exactly. Something deeper. Something more human. "I was wrong," he said. No preamble. No build-up. Just the truth. She said nothing. "I let fear speak louder than what I knew to be true," he continued. "And in doing so, I hurt two people who didn't deserve it." Her gaze didn't harden. It didn't soften either. It just held him steady, like she was waiting to see what kind of man had walked through the door. "I thought I was protecting him," he said. "But the only thing I protected was my pride." She didn't interrupt. "I'm the richest father I know," Graham said with a faint smile that barely touched his eyes. "And I couldn't teach my son how to trust. Or how to feel safe. Or how to let someone in." He pulled something from his coat pocket, a small box. Inside were 12 drawings. Noah's. Each one marked by Clara's quiet influence. Crayon shapes and half-finished suns. Stick figures with open hands. One with a crooked tree in the background. One with a large red heart floating between two smiling faces. He handed them to her wordlessly. Clara looked down at the pages, then back up at him. "I want to do something that matters," he said. "With you. For him. For kids like him." She waited. "I'm not asking you to come back into our lives as a favor," he said. "I'm asking you to help me build something. Something that isn't measured in charts or diagnostics." Her voice, when it finally came, was soft but clear. "What would it look like?" "A place where no one tries to fix them," he said. "Where silence isn't something to be solved. A place where presence is enough." She tilted her head, just slightly. "No boardrooms. No suits," he replied. "No speeches. Only stories," he said. She paused. Then a small smile tugged at her lips. "Then we call it Stillness and Stars." He blinked. "Why?" "Because that's what kids like Noah are," she said. "Still. And full of light." He didn't speak again. He didn't need to. They both knew what had been agreed upon. Not a partnership. Not a project. A promise. Later that evening, Clara stood outside Graham's estate for the first time in weeks. This time, there was no gate between them. No message left with a manager. She simply walked to the door. It opened before she could knock. Noah stood there. He didn't run to her. He didn't smile. He just looked. And then, slowly, he stepped forward. He didn't speak. But he didn't need to. He reached for her hand and placed something in her palm, a feather. Clara looked down, throat tightening. She still remembered the day she brought it. The way he flinched. The way he stayed. She looked up at Graham, who stood behind his son, 1,000 unspoken things in his eyes. They were rebuilding something, not as it was, but as it needed to be. Stronger. Quieter. Real. And in that moment, Clara Reyes knew she hadn't just been part of a boy's healing. She had been part of a man's. No one really knew what to expect on the morning Stillness and Stars quietly opened its doors. There was no ribbon-cutting ceremony, no glitzy PR event. No media invite. No high society crowd gathered for photos. Instead, the launch took place in the back garden of the Asheville Community Center, on a sun-drenched patch of grass bordered by maples just beginning to blush into autumn. Blankets had been laid out across the lawn like soft constellations. There were no rows of chairs, only soft places to sit and breathe. Wooden crates held bundles of crayons and sidewalk chalk. Storybooks sat open in little piles beneath shady trees. A string quartet played near the edge of the garden, not classical, but lullabies, soft and familiar, like music hummed from memory. Children arrived with guarded eyes and uncertain footsteps, each clutching a parent's hand a little tighter than usual. Some wore headphones to block out the world. Others kept their hoods up even in the sun. A few brought their comfort items, blankets, stuffed animals, toy trains that never left their palms. No introductions were required. No one was forced to participate. They were simply told, take your time. There is nothing to prove here. Stillness and Stars wasn't built to fix anyone. It was built to hold space. At the edge of the lawn, near a small wooden stage barely raised off the grass, Clara stood with a quiet steadiness that made her presence feel larger than it was. She wore no badge, no title, no microphone. Just a long cardigan Noah had once reached for during one of his worst days, and in her hand, a worn leather tote still smudged with traces of crayon dust. Noah stood beside her, hands deep in the pockets of his sweater, gaze fixed on the space between his feet. He hadn't said much that morning, hadn't asked where they were going or why. But he hadn't resisted either. He had come. That alone was everything. Graham arrived later, walking with the quiet tension of a man still learning how to be present without needing to control what came next. He didn't wear a suit. For once, there was no invisible wall around him. Just a man. A father. A student of love he had once been too afraid to understand. He stood back at first, not wanting to overwhelm his son. He watched the other children scatter like cautious birds, slowly finding spots where they felt safe enough to sit. He watched Clara kneel next to a boy who had buried himself beneath a blanket, whispering a story through the fabric so softly it almost didn't sound like words. And he watched Noah, whose body was still but not stiff, who hadn't yet run, hadn't yet shrunk. Then something extraordinary happened. Noah stepped forward. Not fast. Not bold. He simply moved. Toward Clara. He didn't reach for her immediately. He stood in front of her for a moment, eyes flicking upward just enough to meet hers. There was a pause, 2 seconds, maybe 3, where everything held its breath. And then he wrapped his arms around her. Not a panic hug. Not a survival cling. A choice. An embrace. Clara froze only for a moment. Then she knelt, returned the hug, and closed her eyes. The garden went silent. Parents stopped mid-conversation. Children who were watching paused whatever they were doing. Even the wind seemed to hush itself. It wasn't just about the boy. It was about what it meant. What it had taken for him to reach this moment. What had been risked, lost, and reclaimed on the path here. And then, almost impossibly, Noah let go, turned, and looked directly at his father. Graham didn't move. He didn't breathe. Noah walked toward him slowly, his hands now outstretched, open palms, soft wrists, an invitation not spoken but unmistakably clear. Graham dropped to his knees. And then his son, his silent, guarded, unreachable son, stepped into his arms and held on. It wasn't the kind of hug you see in movies. It wasn't dramatic or tear-soaked or underscored by swelling music. It was simple. Solid. Human. Noah didn't tremble. Graham didn't try to say anything. There were no apologies, no explanations. Just a boy and his father, at last standing in the same space, truly. After what felt like an eternity and yet somehow not enough, Noah leaned back. He placed one hand on Graham's chest, then looked back at Clara and nodded, just once, like he had handed her something invisible. Later that day, Clara gathered the children under the shade of a wide oak tree and began telling a story. It wasn't from a book. It had no title. She spoke with her hands and her voice and her presence. Once, there was a boy who didn't like to be touched, she began. Not because he didn't want love, but because the world felt too loud and his skin caught fire when things moved too fast. He wasn't broken. He was just, brave in a different way. And one day, someone sat beside him without asking for anything. No questions. No pushing. No fixing. Just stillness. And that stillness made room for something more. A friendship. A story. A hug. As she spoke, the children didn't look away. Even the ones who couldn't meet her eyes seemed to lean in with their hearts. Graham watched from behind the tree line, unseen, but entirely present. He remembered the first day he brought Noah into the cafe. The cold weight in his chest. The discomfort in every muscle. The fear of being seen too closely, of being judged as not enough, as a father, as a man. Now, watching his son sitting cross-legged among children and parents, his hand gently pressing against Clara's, that weight had shifted. He had once measured success in contracts and control. Now he measured it in crayons and eye contact. Stillness and Stars became more than a program in the weeks that followed. It became a home for those who didn't fit into boxes or timelines. Children who had been labeled too difficult, too quiet, too delayed, found themselves instead called artists, listeners, storytellers. Their drawings were displayed along the garden fence. Their silences were honored as sacred. Noah came every week. Sometimes he would read aloud, just a word or two. Sometimes he would sit in silence and sketch elaborate maps of places he'd never seen. But always, he would seek out Clara. And when the days felt too sharp, too noisy, too much, he would sit beside her and wait. She never reached first. She never had to. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low behind the mountains, painting everything gold, Graham approached Clara while she was gathering crayons into a tin. "I still don't know how you did it," he said quietly. She looked up at him, the same calm in her eyes that had first drawn Noah in. "I didn't do anything to him," she replied. "I just stopped asking him to be different." Graham nodded. His eyes drifted toward Noah, who was helping another child build a fort out of pillows beneath the tree. He wasn't clinging to anyone. He wasn't flinching. He was laughing. "I spent most of my life believing vulnerability was weakness," Graham said. "That love was something to be earned. That touch was a reward." Clara didn't interrupt. "But Noah," he continued, voice tightening, "he taught me that sometimes, the strongest thing you can do is reach for someone when you're scared. And the kindest thing you can do is let them stay." They stood in the golden silence for a while, just watching the children move through the space they had helped create. There would still be hard days. Setbacks. Storms. But now, there was something stronger than fear anchoring it all. Trust. Presence. And the knowledge that healing didn't have to be loud or linear. Sometimes, it began with a story. Sometimes, with a hand offered without words. And sometimes, with a hug that changed everything. In a world driven by noise, speed, and performance, some stories whisper their way into our hearts and refuse to leave. This is one of those stories, the kind that doesn't shout, doesn't shock, but lingers. A story not about wealth or success or grand gestures, but about a quiet waitress, a broken billionaire, and a little boy who hadn't spoken in over a year. It began in a diner. Not in a hospital, not in a therapy center, not in some polished office suite. Just a small cafe in Asheville, North Carolina, where worn floors creaked beneath tired boots and the smell of maple syrup wrapped around every memory. Graham Whitaker, logistics magnate, widower, emotionally distant father, walked in with his son Noah, a 7-year-old boy diagnosed with autism and sensory processing disorder. A boy whose body flinched at sound, whose voice had disappeared, and who had never, not once, hugged his own father. It should have been just another quiet breakfast. But fate has a strange way of placing us in exactly the right chair, at exactly the right moment, beside exactly the right stranger. Clara Reyes didn't look like a miracle. She didn't speak like one either. But she moved through the world with a kind of softness that demanded nothing, proved nothing, yet made space for everything. When a plate shattered in the kitchen and Noah's body jolted with fear, it wasn't Graham, frozen in his seat, who brought the boy back. It was Clara. Not with words. Not with instruction. Just with stillness. She opened her arms and waited. And the boy who wouldn't be touched walked into them. It's easy to look back and name that moment a turning point. But the truth is, no one knew then what had begun to unfold. Not Graham, who watched in disbelief. Not Clara, who held him like she'd been waiting for him all her life. And not Noah, who only knew that, for one breathtaking second, he felt safe. What followed wasn't magic. It was patience. Clara began visiting the Whitaker estate, not as a therapist, not as a nanny, but as a quiet presence in Noah's sunroom. She didn't bring programs. She brought pencils. She didn't demand connection. She waited for it. And slowly, ritual by ritual, color by color, the world inside Noah began to shift. She created space where silence wasn't shameful. She told stories with her hands. She invited him to play with crayons instead of questions. She honored every flinch, every shrug, every breath. And Graham watched. The man who had built an empire with discipline and precision now stood quietly outside his own son's doorway, unsure of how to love what he couldn't control. But in watching, he learned. Not from therapists or consultants, but from the grace of a woman who understood that healing isn't about fixing someone, it's about holding them long enough for them to feel whole again. The story could have ended there. But life rarely unfolds that gently. One photograph, a single, careless snapshot taken by a passing traveler, turned everything upside down. A picture of Noah clinging to Clara in the diner during another moment of sensory distress went viral. Headlines questioned boundaries. Blogs twisted the narrative. And in a panic to protect what he didn't understand, Graham ended it all. No warning. No conversation. Just a message. The visits were over. And with them, the fragile threads that Noah had begun to trust unraveled. He stopped drawing. Stopped humming. Stopped sleeping. Even Graham, despite his best efforts, couldn't reach him. Because love, once betrayed, doesn't disappear. It simply hides. It took days, long, aching, silent days, before the truth emerged. The photo wasn't leaked by Clara. There had been no betrayal. Just thoughtlessness by someone who didn't know what they were looking at. When Graham learned this, he realized what he'd done. He hadn't just severed a connection. He had dismissed it. But Clara never reached out. She didn't defend herself. She understood that real connection doesn't beg to be believed. It simply waits. When Graham found her again, reading to children at the community art center, voice calm, hands moving like story threads, he didn't bring pride. He brought apology. And a proposition. Not to return. To build something. Together, they created Stillness and Stars, a space for children like Noah to experience connection without performance, safety without expectations, presence without pressure. It wasn't therapy. It wasn't education. It was, simply, a sanctuary. The launch was nothing glamorous. No cameras. No press releases. Just blankets on grass. Books. Crayons. Music that felt like breathing. And in the middle of it all stood Noah. Not the boy from the diner. Not the boy who once shook at sound. But a boy who stepped into Clara's arms by choice. Who turned to his father and lifted his arms in an open, sacred invitation. And Graham, this man of contracts and caution, knelt. And held his son for the first time, not as a duty, but as a gift. That moment didn't fix the world. It didn't erase the pain or promise perfection. But it redefined what healing can look like. What it should look like. Not loud. Not rushed. Not transactional. Just stillness. And stars. So, what do we take away from a story like this? What wisdom lives inside the quiet? First, we learn that love is not always loud. It does not always announce itself with declarations or guarantees. Sometimes love comes as presence, as silence, as waiting just long enough for someone else to feel safe in your company. Second, we are reminded that children do not need to be fixed. They need to be understood. Held. Respected. Trusted in their own timing. And that includes every child, whether they speak, whether they flinch, whether they draw their hearts as stick figures in red crayon. Third, this story teaches us something about forgiveness. About the grace required to admit when we're wrong, and the strength it takes to rebuild what we've broken. Graham didn't find redemption in money or control. He found it in kneeling, physically, emotionally, and choosing connection over ego. And finally, we realize that the richest moments in life aren't measured by status or spreadsheets, but by presence. By the warmth of a hug given freely. By the space we create for others to simply be. In today's world, where attention spans are short and distractions are endless, stories like this remind us of what truly matters. They nudge us to slow down. To notice the small things. The quiet things. The things that heal not with noise, but with gentleness. So if you take one lesson with you today, let it be this. You don't have to be extraordinary to change someone's life. You just have to show up. And stay. Thank you for joining us through every moment of this story. Through every whisper, every turning point, every piece of heartbreak and healing. If this touched something in you, if you found yourself rooting for Noah, or shedding a quiet tear for Clara, or seeing a bit of yourself in Graham, then this story has done what it was meant to do. We hope it reminded you of the power of presence, the depth of stillness, and the beauty of the unspoken. If you want to hear more stories like this, stories that don't just entertain but transform, stories that inspire without shouting, we invite you to stay with us. Subscribe to the channel. It means the world to us, and it gives us the fuel to keep creating content that matters, stories that hold space for the broken and the brave, for the soft and the strong. We'll be back next time with something just as honest, just as human, and just as unforgettable. Until then, hold someone close. And don't underestimate what one quiet moment can do.